Thank you very much. I'd like to start by thanking Charles Michael. I have the honor of holding the chair in his name, and I would like very much to thank him also for making this event possible. Jerry Muller is a professor of history at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C., and he is the chair of the Department of History. He is the author of 5 books, most recently, Capitalism and the Jews, which was published by Princeton University Press early in 2010, and it has been translated into Russian, Portuguese, Japanese. His previous books include Adam Smith in His Time and Ours, and The Mind and the Market, Capitalism and Modern European Thought. His lecture series, Thinking About Capitalism, was released in 2009 by the Teaching Company, and he has published widely in numerous journals like Foreign Affairs, The New Republic, Wall Street Journal, Times Literary Supplement, as well as in many scholarly journals. His most recent publication is Capitalism and Inequality, What the Right and Left Got Wrong, which was published in Foreign Affairs, April 2013. And he's currently at work on another book entitled The Transgressive Rabbi, The Life and Times of Jacob Taubes. So I present you Jerry Muller.
Thank you, Aaron. So it's a sizable hall. I trust you can all hear me. If you can't see me from the back, you're not missing much. And I should say that I've looked at the price of the tickets, and I can assure you the talk will be worth every cent that you paid. So, capitalism and the Jews. This is a subject that makes a lot of people nervous for reasons that I'll explore later in my talk. But you can't properly understand the modern history of the Jews without thinking about the links between Jews and capitalism. It's not that without the Jews, modern capitalism would have developed in some fundamentally different way. I don't think that's the case. But it is the case that in many times and places, Jews have played a disproportionate role in capitalist economic development. They've been disproportionately involved in classic entrepreneurial functions like finding new markets for existing products. Think of the rag trade in the 19th century. Or pioneering new modes of sales and distribution, starting from peddling, which is an important mode of sale and distribution for people who don't otherwise have access to consumer goods, through the development in the late 20th century of box stores, itself a new form of retailing. Many modern capitalist institutions, which were not entirely or even primarily created by Jews, have had a disproportionate number of Jews as entrepreneurial innovators. The rise of department stores, for example, which was an important marketing breakthrough that changed the nature of the shopping experience in the late 19th century, was in good part a creation of Jews, both in Germany and in the United States. So was the rise of catalog shopping, created in the United States by Sears Roebuck, headed by someone whose name was not Sears and not Roebuck, but was Julius Rosenwald. Or other later marketing innovations like, as I've mentioned, box stores, think of Home Depot, Bed Bath & Beyond, what have you. And above all, Jews have been innovators in the realm of entertainment and information, which are actually some of the fastest growing parts of the capitalist economy from the second half of the 19th century to the present. In the creation and expansion of newspapers and magazines, in the development both in Europe and the United States of new forms of theater, like burlesque and vaudeville, in the creation of professional, that is to say, commercialized sports, and of course, in the movie industry. In each case, these forms of information and entertainment were what you might call virgin ground. That is, they were outside of the existing economic establishment, and so they were a particularly promising site for entrepreneurial innovation. And I'm not going to dwell on entrepreneurial innovation, but given where we are, let's not forget about Google, founded by Sergey Brin, a Jewish immigrant from the former Soviet Union, and Larry Page. Jews have also been disproportionately successful in capitalist societies, in commerce, in the realm of finance, and also in the learned professions. That disproportionate success could itself be a source of envy and resentment, though in ways that vary tremendously from one national context to another. So the theme of capitalism and the Jews is important in a number of ways. One of the characteristics of capitalism is that it's an economy based upon exchange that's denoted in monetary terms. And as you'll see, how capitalism was interpreted by non-Jewish thinkers and non-Jewish political movements was often influenced by the historical association between Jews and money. And as you'll see, how Jews were viewed by non-Jews often depended on how those non-Jews thought about capitalism. And all of this then affected the way in which Jews thought about themselves as well. And so in today's talk, I want to touch upon all of these themes, as well as try to understand why Jews have done disproportionately well, and the reactions, both positive and negative, that relative success have aroused. Some of these issues are deeply intertwined, the issues of how Jews were viewed by non-Jews, how Jews viewed themselves, and how capitalism itself was interpreted by non-Jewish political thinkers and political movements. So let's move back a bit. Jews and capitalism have long been linked in the Western mind. Ever since the Middle Ages, Jews were associated in the Christian West with the handling of money. Some of the reasons for that are relatively well known. For the most part, Jews in the Christian medieval West were prohibited from owning land. They were also, by and large, kept out of artisanal life. Artisans like shoemakers or silversmiths were organized into guilds, and those guilds had economic and social and religious aspects. They typically had a patron saint, for example, and so they didn't admit Jews. For these reasons, but also for other reasons that I'll turn to later in the talk, Jews in medieval Europe were often engaged in one form or another of commerce. Let's remember the Jews in medieval Europe were a tolerated but stigmatized minority. It's important to keep in mind that for much of the Middle Ages and in much of Europe, Jews were the only tolerated minority. They were tolerated because of reasons having to do with Christian theology. According to Christian theologians from at least the time of Augustine on, there was a place for Jews in the Christian conception of salvation. They were the people who, first of all, legitimated or gave evidence of the book, what they called the Old Testament, that was the basis of the New Testament. And they had a place in the Christian scheme of salvation in that at the end of time, with the return of Jesus, they would recognize him, and that was part of their historical role. But of course, they were also stigmatized. They were also stigmatized because when Jesus appeared the first time, they did not recognize him as the Messiah. And so they were accused of having a kind of stiff-neckedness and blindness. And because they were the people who had demonstrated these character traits, they were to be tolerated, but they were also to be stigmatized. That is to say, in many ways, they were regarded as outside of the community of shared values. And it's precisely because Jews were regarded as outside of the community of the saved, that they were permitted by the church in the Middle Ages to engage in the stigmatized activity of usury. Usury was the condemnation of lending money at interest. This is important to understand. We don't use the term very much anymore. When we do, usury usually means lending money at excessively high interest. But that's not what it meant traditionally. It meant the illegitimacy of lending money at any sort of interest. And that condemnation of usury is important to understand because it provided a set of concepts and metaphors and ways of thinking about money that were not just predominant in ancient Europe and in medieval Europe, but that had a kind of important afterlife in modern European thought and politics. The condemnation of usury reflected a deep suspicion of commerce, and especially of finance, in the Christian West. This condemnation of usury actually has two different roots. One is a classical Greek root, and the other is a biblical root. So let's start for a moment with the classical Greek root. Most classical Greek thinkers thought that there was no economic justification for deriving income from the merchant's role of buying and selling goods. Why, they thought, should people who don't grow anything and people who don't manufacture anything, why should they be entitled to a profit? What's the moral legitimacy of that? These ancient Greek thinkers began with the assumption that the material wealth of humanity was more or less fixed. So if there was a gain on one side, if somebody made a gain from a transaction, somebody else had to lose on the other side. In other words, to speak a more modern jargon, they thought of economic life as a zero-sum game. And as a result, profits from trade in general were regarded as morally suspect by the leading thinkers of ancient Greece. And of all the forms of commerce, the one that was most suspect was finance, that is to say, the making of money from money. Aristotle regarded the lending of money for the sake of lending interest as unnatural, and he morally condemned it. This practice, which Aristotle thought was blameworthy, Christian theologians decided in the Middle Ages was in fact sinful. And here they drew upon the Hebrew Bible. A verse from the 23rd chapter of the book of Deuteronomy prohibited Jews from lending with interest to one another, but did allow them to lend to non-Jews. The passage reads, "You may lend with interest to foreigners, but to your brother, achicha, you may not lend with interest." By the 12th century, medieval Christian theologians were rediscovering Aristotle. And this rediscovery of Aristotle, together with this portion of the Bible, led them to conclude that the term brother in the chapter from Deuteronomy really applied to all men, and so the lending of money at interest was always sinful. The problem was that they came to this conclusion at a time that historians now refer to as the commercial revolution of the Middle Ages, from about 1100 to 1300. This was a period in which there were greater agricultural surpluses, there was greater urbanization, and to make a long story short, there was a lot more trade. But the problem is you can't have trade, or it's very hard to have trade, without credit. And credit, of course, involves interest, the taking of interest. So there was a tension between the theological precepts of Christian thinkers and the new realities of economic life. So one way in which the church resolved this dilemma, beginning in the 12th century, was to try to prevent the evil of Christian usury by allowing Jews to engage in that stigmatized economic activity. Jews weren't subject to the prohibitions of canon law, and they were condemned in any case for their repudiation of Christ. And so there began this association of money making and money lending with the Jews. an association that would further taint attitudes towards commerce in general and finance in particular among Christians. This notion that usury is immoral or sinful expressed in sophisticated terms a sentiment that is really very widespread among peasants and manual workers in most times and places. And that sentiment is that only those people whose labor produces sweat are engaged in real productive work, and that those whose work doesn't involve moving around and engaging in physical labor are in some sense living off the work of those who sweat. And that way of conceiving of economic activity, this doctrine of usury, which, as I say, in some ways formalized and conceptualized a much more widespread sentiment that only those whose work produces sweat are really producing. That doctrine of usury led to a failure to recognize the role of knowledge and the evaluation of risk in economic life. That is to say, it led to a pattern of thought that was to condemn first finance and sometimes commerce more generally. But the notion that people who engage in trade, and especially in finance, are fundamentally unproductive and parasitic would live on in modern political movements of the radical left and of the radical right. Indeed, one could say that it provides what you might call the deep structure of Marxist thought. Marx himself, by the way, recognized this. In his notebooks, we find him quoting Luther's tirades against moneylenders. And then Marx writes that Luther, quote, has really caught the character of old-fashioned usury and that of capital as a whole, unquote. The argument of Marx's great book, Kapital, rests on what's called the labor theory of value. And the labor theory of value asserts that capital and the people that wield it are fundamentally unproductive. Take, for example, the chapter of Kapital called The General Formula of Capital. It has one main point, that capital is money that makes money. In capitalist society, it does so through the intermediary stage of a merchant who buys and sells commodities or an industrialist who buys and sells labor. But it's still money making money. Or in Karl Marx's resonant image, and I quote, the capitalist knows that all commodities, however shabby they may look or bad they may smell, are in faith and in fact money. Internally circumcised Jews, and in addition, magical means by which to make more money out of money. End of quote. So here you see all the traditional prejudices against usury now reformulated as a critique of the market in the age of industry. For Marx, as for Aristotle, and as for Luther, money, now rechristened capital, is fundamentally unproductive. And those who wield it do so by definition at the expense of others. In fact, the Marxist theory of exploitation, which doesn't have much analytic precision, but does have a lot of moral burden, acquires much of its resonance from its continuity with the notion that capitalists, like usurers, grow rich by not working, by unjustly living off of the work of others. Marx was by no means the first to connect the critique of capitalism with the traditional stigmatization of usury, nor was he the last. For much of the 19th century, the attack on capitalism took the form of an attack on the Jews, especially or paradigmatically on the Rothschilds, the personifications of Jewish finance. One finds these arguments on the radical left and also on the radical right. We find the same stigmatization of financial activity in the musings of the Nazi economic theorist Gottfried Feder. The official platform of the Nazi Party, which Feder helped to formulate, called for the breaking of interest slavery, once again echoing this condemnation of usury. So tracing the long shadow of usury casts an unexpected, but I think an important light on the history of thinking about capitalism and about the Jews. For better or for worse, the image of the Jew and the evaluation of capitalism have often been deeply intertwined. Often in looking through modern European and American intellectual history, we find that those thinkers who saw a positive role for commerce tended to be sympathetic to the Jews, seeing their activity as promoting the advance of civilization. We find that in liberal thinkers from Montesquieu through Friedrich Hayek in the 20th century. Whereas those thinkers who tended to be hostile to capitalism tended to be hostile to the Jews. Now, all of this also affected the way in which Jews thought about themselves. Was their link to commerce something to be applauded, something to be proud of, or was the connection between Jews and commerce something that ought to be a source of shame and a cause for reformation? In the 17th and 18th centuries, when Jews were still excluded from residence in many parts of Europe, Jewish spokesmen who argued for the toleration of the Jews, that is, for their admission into various societies, often did so on the grounds of the economic benefits that they would bring. In 1638, when the Jews of Venice were threatened with expulsion from the city, the Venetian rabbi Simone Luzzatto penned his Discourse on the Condition of the Jews. And there he argued the Jews were ideally suited to perform the role of a nation's commercial agents because they possessed trading skills that had been honed over centuries by their exclusion from other sources of livelihood. And that line of argument was picked up a few years later by Manasseh ben Israel, a rabbi from Amsterdam who in 1655 petitioned the government of Oliver Cromwell to readmit the Jews into England. Manasseh pointed to the advantages of admitting the Jews, including their knowledge of trade and finance and their international commercial connections. Merchandising is, as it were, the proper profession of the nation of the Jews, he contended. In fact, Manasseh regarded the Jewish talent for commerce as providential. God knew that they would be exiled to all the corners of the earth, and so to give the peoples of all the corners of the earth an incentive to admit and keep the Jews, he providentially gave Jews this financial and commercial acumen. In the late 18th century, the greatest figure of the Jewish Enlightenment, Moses Mendelssohn, made a more sweeping argument. Mendelssohn, who by the way earned his living as a merchant, argued that the traditional commercial occupations that the Jews were involved in were genuinely beneficial to society at large. He noted that the popular notion that commerce and trade were less useful or less productive than manual labor was a fallacy. He said they were based on a fundamental misunderstanding. Here's the way he puts it. It's a rather long quote, but it's really very telling because it has to do precisely with this issue of, do people really engage in productive activity if they're not producing sweat? Here's what he says. Not only making something, but doing something is also producing. Not only he who labors with his hands deserves to be called a producer, but rather anyone who promotes, occasions, or facilitates anything that might tend to the benefit or comfort of his fellow creatures deserves to be called a producer. And at times, he deserves the title producer the less you see him move his hands and feet. Many a merchant, while quietly engaged at his desk in forming commercial speculations, or while lolling on his sofa, pondering on distant adventures, produces more than the most active and noisy mechanic or tradesman. End of quote. So, in the early modern period, and to some degree through the 19th and 20th century, you had Jewish thinkers who defended the connection between Jews and trade, and between Jews and commerce, and between Jews and finance, and Jews and money. But many of the notions that I mentioned that associated trade with a lack of productivity found their echoes in Jewish circles as well. That is to say, some Jews came to accept, to a greater or lesser degree, this anti-Semitic critique of Jewish economic patterns. One finds that, for example, among Jewish socialists, among some strains of labor Zionism, and even sometimes among capitalist Jewish philanthropists. From the late 19th century through the early decades of the 20th century, there were a series of attempts to move Jews from commerce and finance into crafts and into farming. In the United States, the banker and philanthropist Jacob Schiff created the Jewish Immigrants Information Bureau in 1907 to try to encourage Jews to settle as farmers in Texas rather than crowd into New York as garment workers. The largest Jewish colonization project of the interwar era, which is now hardly remembered, was the work of the Agro Joint in the Soviet Union. From 1924 to 1938, it spent about $16 million, most of it which came from well-to-do Jewish philanthropists in the United States, to try to settle some 60,000 Jews in 1 million acres in the Ukraine and the Crimea. The experiment failed rather dismally. Now, in historical retrospect, these projects have a peculiar kind of untimeliness. Attempts to create Jewish farmers and industrial workers, while capitalist development was moving towards an economy based increasingly on white-collar occupations, on services, and on the expansion of retailing. But while these would-be reformers were trying to move Jews out of trade, the Jewish masses responded by moving themselves to where opportunities for trade were greater, namely out of Russia and Eastern Europe, where most of them lived, to Western Europe and to the United States. As the development of modern capitalism created economic opportunities in Europe and in its colonial offshoots, like the United States, Jews were disproportionately successful at seizing those opportunities. And that's in good part because the Jews of Europe were well positioned to do so by their earlier history. Let's take a very brief look at the most relevant elements of that history for understanding why Jews were particularly well positioned to thrive and to excel in capitalist societies when legal opportunities became available to them. At the beginning of the modern period, say about 1700, about half the Jews in the world lived in Eastern Europe. Most of them had come there during the 16th and 17th centuries, when large numbers of Jews had settled in what was then called the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. In the 18th century, Poland was divided up among the Romanov Empire, the Russian Empire, the Habsburg Empire, what became Austria-Hungary, and Prussia. The largest group of those Jews lived in the Romanov Empire, and there, most Jews were restricted to living in an area called the Pale of Settlement, that is, the westernmost area of Russia between the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea, where Jews often comprised a substantial portion of the urban population. For the most part, Jews in the Romanov Empire were legally confined to this rather backward economic region. Only a handful of them were permitted to live and work in the regions of the empire that were growing the fastest economically, where economic opportunity was greater. Now, before the 19th century, most Jews in this area made their living through one or another form of commerce. Often it was just through petty trade. Sometimes it was through tavern keeping. On a higher level, it was through leasing and managing the estates of the nobility. But in the course of the 19th century, something happened that made it impossible for such a high proportion of the Jewish population to be involved in trade and commerce. And that is that in the 19th century, the Jews of Eastern Europe experienced one of the most rapid population increases in all of Europe. Their numbers grew from about 1.5 million at the beginning of the 19th century to almost 8 million by 1913. While there was population growth occurring throughout Europe in the period, the Jewish rate of population growth outstripped that of their non-Jewish counterparts. So you had this rapid expansion of the number of Jews living in an area that was economically backward with very constrained opportunities and with government restrictions on their freedom of movement, their freedom of trade, and so on. And that made it impossible for many Jews to remain in commerce. And so in the course of the 19th and early 20th century, many of the Jews of this Pale of Settlement moved out of trade. Some became semi-skilled handicraft workers, mostly in small workshops that were owned by other Jews. Most of the Jewish population of the Pale of Settlement was poor and eked out a living in economic pursuits like tailoring and so on with low levels of productivity. So it was no wonder that Eastern Europe in the late 19th century and early 20th century became the crucible of Jewish socialism, because the prospects of improvement under capitalism seemed rather hopeless. The main response of most of these people was, of course, to emigrate. And by 1914, 2.5 million Jews from the Romanov and Habsburg empires had emigrated, the largest bulk of them going to the United States and a smaller number to the countries of Western Europe and Canada and Latin America. In the great wave of Jewish migration from Eastern Europe after 1880, the largest number settled in New York City. There, 2/3 of the immigrants were at first employed in the clothing trade. Jewish immigrants came with even less capital than most turn-of-the-century immigrants. They went into an industry that had some of the worst working conditions and with low wages. As laborers, Jews were active in trade unions, but they didn't think of themselves as part of a transgenerational working class. On the contrary, they wanted something different for themselves, if possible, and certainly for their children. A substantial number of those first-generation immigrants moved from the ranks of workers to the ranks of entrepreneurs, first in the clothing trades and then beyond. By the second generation, they'd often moved into other forms of retailing and then into real estate and the professions. In many regions of the United States outside of New York, especially in the South and the Midwest, and to some degree in the West itself, Jews began as peddlers. Peddlers are a very historically important form of entrepreneurship. Peddling is the lowest rung on the entrepreneurial ladder, where someone goes out literally with his goods on his back or with a horse and cart and goes into the countryside and sells goods to peasants or to farmers who otherwise wouldn't have access to those goods. And from peddling, Jews often moved up to shop owning and other forms of retailing. And then a generation later, some of them made the transition to the professions. If you look at the very broad pattern of modern Jewish history in Europe and the United States, you see that Jews tended to prosper wherever they attained that civic equality that allowed them to engage freely in market activity. Jews possessed basic equality of civil rights in the United States from the founding of the new nation in 1776. In the course of the 19th century, Jews were granted civic equality first in Western Europe, in Britain and France, and then in the newly created German Empire in 1871, and shortly thereafter in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They didn't achieve equality of civil rights in the Romanov Empire, in the Russian Empire, until the fall of the Tsarist regime in 1917. Civic equality meant that legally, at least, Jews were able to compete economically with non-Jews on equal terms. And in each case, the opening up of opportunity led to disproportionate Jewish economic success, or to put it another way, to a huge increase in Jewish contributions to economic life. And since economic life isn't a distinct domain, that meant Jewish contributions to and overrepresentation in a variety of realms, from trade to medicine to culture. It was in Central Europe, across Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, that Jewish economic success was most conspicuous from the mid-19th century through the rise of National Socialism. In Germany, where Jews comprised about 1% of the population on the eve of the First World War, Jews comprised about a third of the corporate elite. In Hungary, by the 1920s, half the owners of commercial establishments were Jews. And Jews also comprised much of the entrepreneurial class in interwar Poland. Jews were active not only in commerce and in finance, but also in those occupations that required a higher education, in the free professions. And no group was more committed to acquiring higher education and the professional occupations that higher education made possible. By the early 20th century, especially in the capitals and larger cities of Central and Eastern Europe, in Vienna, in Warsaw, in Prague, or in Budapest, cities where Jews typically comprised 5 to 10% of the population, they often made up half the lawyers, half the engineers, half the pharmacists, half the architects. If Jewish economic performance in Central Europe in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was striking, Jewish economic success in the United States would eventually become equally remarkable. As I've mentioned, Jews moved rather rapidly out of manual labor, in which many first-generation immigrants had been engaged, and into proprietorship, management, and professional and technical fields. As had been the case in Europe, Jews in the United States were astonishingly oriented to higher education. By the mid-1970s, when just under half of Americans went to college, 80% of Jews did. By the early 1980s, when Forbes magazine began to compile its annual list of the 400 richest Americans, Jews were conspicuously overrepresented. They comprised about 3% of the population at that time, and when this list was first compiled in the 1980s, they made up of about a quarter of the names on the list. Since then, they've gone up somewhat. So how should we account for this disproportionate success? Well, for Jews, there were both push and pull factors. As we've seen, Jews had a preference for market-oriented occupations going back to the Middle Ages. That was partly because Jews were pushed out of other economic activities like farming and artisanry, but there were also factors that pulled the Jews into commerce. First of all, there was their comparative advantage. Jewish males tended to be disproportionately literate compared to the surrounding population. I don't mean that all of them were literate, but by and large, Jewish culture, a culture of Torah and Talmud study, was one that required a certain level of literacy of males. And so, on the whole, Jews were a lot more literate than the populations around them in medieval Europe and in much of early modern and modern Europe as well. And that gave them particular advantages. It gave them a kind of niche when it came to commerce, because to engage in commerce, it helps a lot to be able to read and write. And so that was one of the factors pulling Jews into commerce. Also, you could say that compared to Christianity, Judaism was more favorably disposed towards commerce. Talmudic law, which educated Jews continued to study and refine through the ages, was replete with debates about economic matters, including contracts, torts, and prices. Think of where one traditionally begins with the study of the Talmud. Does one begin with the issue of God or revelation? No, it's the first Mishnah that Jews were traditionally taught was Shnayim ochazim b'talit. Two people are holding on to a talit, to a prayer shawl. So it's about a property dispute. And so even Jews who were rabbinically trained did have a certain knowledge of basic economic concepts. Also, in the Middle Ages, rabbinic authorities wanted to encourage Jewish men to devote as much time as possible to study. And they therefore preferred commerce to crafts or to agriculture on the grounds that commerce was less time-consuming. It might be mentally demanding, but you didn't have to do it sort of 24 hours a day in the way that you did if you were a farmer or if you were an artisan. And so you could say that the suspicion of commerce and of merchants that was so prominent in the Christian tradition was lacking among Jews. And so in addition to the push factors that people commonly mention, we should keep in mind these pull factors, factors that pull Jews into commerce. And so in pre-modern European societies, Jews were outside of the feudal order of landowning gentry, of a mass of serfs, and artisans organized into exclusive guilds. Jews were most often middlemen between producers and consumers. And that meant that to survive in the world, they had to cultivate a kind of economic ethos based on maximizing profitability, based on assessing risk, based on exploring new markets, and based on minimizing consumption to maximize the accumulation of capital. Another part of their cultural ethos was what one sociologist has dubbed religious intellectualism. What do I mean by that? Remember that at most times and places, most people were illiterate. For them, every book was a closed book, right? And even when they were able to read, they were not much inclined to do so. The Jews were different in that respect. Theirs was a religion oriented towards continuous contact with texts, a culture of handling books, reading them, reflecting upon their messages, cultivating the habits of finding differences and commonalities in arguments. It was a culture that also prized the ability to make oral arguments. And those kinds of cultural traits, which have a religious origin, were eventually easily transferred from the religious to the secular realms, from the realm of religious learning to secular learning, from holy writ to legal texts and medical texts, from the yeshiva to the law court. It's no wonder then that when the learned professions were open to them, Jews tended to excel in them. Another cultural trait that affected the Jewish response to capitalism was the propensity to high familial investment in children. Long before the term human capital was coined by economists, Jews were investing heavily in it. The care and attention lavished upon Jewish children by Jewish mothers was a cultural stereotype. And like many stereotypes, it reflected an underlying reality. In America, working-class Jewish immigrants were distinguished from most of their non-Jewish counterparts by their willingness to forego income from their children's labor in favor of having the children attend school longer or learn trades. And this emphasis on human capital formation also led Jews to bring down their fertility faster and sooner than almost any other group so that they could invest more in each child, so to speak. All of this then was a recipe for what economists now sometimes call cultural capital. That is to say, Jews had many of the behavioral traits that were conducive to success in a capitalist society. And they entered commercializing societies with a stock of know-how from their families and communities about how markets worked, about calculating profit and loss, and assessing and taking risks. Most important, and this is hardest to put one's finger on and to specify, Jews demonstrated a propensity for discovering new wants and for bringing underused resources to the market. Here, the lack of a settled Jewish craft tradition actually helped. That is to say, Jews weren't committed to staying in a particular branch of the economy. They were more willing than most people who came from a more settled craft tradition. Jews were more willing to move from one branch of the economy to another as new opportunities arose. And that's very important in terms of success in a dynamic capitalist society. You might say it's the difference between a family being in a business and being in business. Being in a business means you have this familial tradition of being in a business and you're going to stay in that business. But often in the history of capitalism, success depends not just on getting into a market at the right time, but exiting a market at the right time too. And Jews were more likely to think of themselves as in business rather than in a business, and they were willing to leave declining parts of the economy when they saw that that sector of the economy that they had traditionally been involved in was in decline. Another factor that helps explain Jewish economic success was what you might call social capital. That is to say, by virtue of their religion, Jews were subject to prejudice and exclusion by the larger Gentile society. And that made Jews more likely to feel a sense of commonality with other Jews. And it often took, that sense of commonality was often conducive to forming trade networks, regional trade networks and international trade networks. So for all of those reasons, one of the most significant trends is that Jews were particularly good at capitalism. They tended to prosper whenever civic equality allowed them to engage freely in market activity. And that in turn led to reactions both positive and negative. Jewish economic success had a very different salience depending on the larger economy that they were part of. And that led to very different reactions to the Jews. Let me explain. In countries like Britain and the United States, when Jews came there in the 19th century, those were already highly commercial societies in which most capitalist development was carried out by non-Jews. So if Jews eventually were successful in that economy, they didn't really stick out that much, except in perhaps branches in the economy that they helped to found and where they were very prominent, like Hollywood. By contrast, in a place like Eastern Europe, capitalism was a new phenomenon, and the non-Jewish majority was typically made up of landowners and peasants, neither of whom were particularly adept at market activity. In those societies, Jews were the commercial class, and that led to a close identification of capitalism with the Jews. In those sorts of societies, with the rise of modern ethnic nationalism, Jews increasingly came to be seen as others, not just as others, but others who were more successful and who were therefore an object of resentment and envy to many parts of the population. Modern anti-Semitism has many sources and varieties, but one of its distinctive characteristics is how often it's based on envy and resentment. So in some countries, especially those countries with a high suspicion of commerce, Jews were hated not because they were seen as inferior, but because they were seen as economically more successful than their non-Jewish counterparts. And economic resentment of Jewish success was not the only cause of anti-Semitism in 20th century Europe, and especially in those parts of Europe that ultimately led to the Holocaust, but it was one important element of anti-Semitism. And that too is part of the history of capitalism and the Jews. So I've tried to argue the relationship of the Jews to capitalism is central to understanding modern Jewish history. Given that significance, the subject has received less attention than its importance merits. Let me just end by saying a little bit about why that's been the case. For economists, the extent to which modern capitalism has been shaped by pre-modern cultural conceptions and pre-modern cultural dispositions is a source of puzzlement at best and dismissal at worst. It's simply too hard to measure, and so it doesn't fit into their categories, into the categories in which economists typically think. In recent decades, they've added this term human capital to their kit bag, but they prefer to think in terms of measurable criteria, like the number of years of schooling. To the extent that human capital involves character traits and varieties of know-how that aren't provided by formal education, it becomes methodologically elusive. For Jews, economic success disproportionate Jewish economic success has long been a source of both pride and embarrassment. The fact that Jewish economic success led anti-Semites to condemn capitalism as a form of Jewish domination or exploitation, or attributed Jewish success to unsavory qualities of the Jews themselves, led Jews to downplay the reality of Jewish economic achievement. For all these reasons, the exploration of Jews and capitalism has tended to be left to apologists, ideologues, and anti-Semites. But it doesn't have to be. In the last decade or two, there's a promising trend among Jewish historians, some of whom have started to turn back to a systematic exploration of the history of Jews and capitalism. And I've drawn upon some of that research in my book that you see the cover of there, and in my talk this evening. But I hope that I've shown you that the subject of capitalism and the Jews deserves to be thought of in a sober and objective way, and that it's central to understanding the modern fate of the Jews. Thank you.
So we have time for some questions. If you have one, we would like to ask you to come out to the aisle and ask it. Thanks. Okay, first question over here.
In his books, one book by The Eighth Day by Korinsky and Shaping of Jewish History by Rivkin, they both comment on the fact that Jewish civilizations or Jewish cultures flourished in freedom, starting back in the late Roman market economy, where even the Hebrew word tuvin comes from the word tov, which means goods that are bought and sold. So the question is, do you consider that to be an example of early capitalism, even before the modern version that we started with, or we have now?
There was trade and commerce in the Roman Empire. I'm not aware that Jews were disproportionately involved in it. And of course, there obviously was trade in the time of, lots of trade in the time of the Mishnah and the Gemara, which is why there's a lot of attention given to economic issues there. That having been said, there's a difference between trade, which exists to some degree in every society, and commerce, which exists to a greater or lesser degree in any society, and capitalism, which you might define as a society in which most people, in which life is commoditized. That is to say, in which most people buy most of what they need and sell most of what they produce. And in those kinds of capitalist economies, the Jews' former training in commerce, as it were, turned out to be particularly useful. So I'm not very good at making historical generalizations that go from the Roman Empire to the present, but those are, I think, the most salient things to keep in mind.
Next question up front.
When the Jews were invited into Poland in the 15th and 16th century, they were given certain advantages because of their literacy. They were allowed to turn grain into alcohol. They were allowed to open the inns and to manage the estates of the aristocracy. So would not that account for the rise in a certain amount of anti-Semitism, except for the fact that the Jews were now allowed to own land and so pushed into smaller communities? Would you like to speak a little bit to that?
The fact that they were engaged, you're right that they were brought in by the Polish-Lithuanian aristocracy to benefit that aristocracy. And one of the ways in which they benefited that aristocracy was conducting these economic activities, part of which took revenue from the peasants and moved it temporarily to the Jews, who could then be taxed by the Polish nobility. So in one way, tavern keeping and innkeeping was a form of that. and also insofar as Jews did manage the estate of, that is to say, however, it's important to keep in mind, most of the people that were coming to those taverns were the peasants themselves, right? They weren't forced into the taverns. They seemed to like what they found there. Yes, Jews often did play a role in managing the estates of the nobility in first the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and then in its aftermath. And sometimes that was a source of resentment. Yes.
The next question up here in the center.
Yes, thank you for your talk. Your model, or I'm over here to your right.
Oh, okay.
Your model, which talks about Jewish success, envy, and resentment on the part of the non-Jewish community. Mm-hmm. If you write that a little larger and take it to the Middle East, and over the years, if you take what began as perhaps a nationalist and political confrontation and struggle, and which over the years seems to perhaps those of us just as observers have become increasingly, I guess, intensified by a strong element of anti-Semitism in the Muslim world. Does the success of Israel as an economy and as a growing and increasingly successful economy contribute to, or in any way help us understand in your model, what's going on in terms of the relationship between Jews and Arabs?
That's a complicated question. Let's begin with something. One of the most remarkable things that's happened in the last 30 years, roughly speaking, is the transformation of Israel into which always had an element of capitalism in it, going back to the Yishuv, to the pre-state Jewish settlement there. But it was long a society, at least in its first decades, in which capitalist activity was frowned upon by the dominant ideology. That's completely been eliminated in the last 30 years, and Israel has a remarkable level of entrepreneurship, of founding new companies and so on. Warren Buffett just bought Israel Metal. He'd owned 80% of it. Now he bought the other 20% because it was doing so well. So the transformation of Israel into a major, or at least for a small country, into a major entrepreneurial force is itself one of the most remarkable trends of the last few decades. I don't think that the antipathy of the Arab or Muslim world to Israel has much to do with the fact that it is a much more economically dynamic society. Its roots really have to do with disputes over land and the fact that for many Muslims, the creation of a sovereign Jewish state in Dar al-Islam, in the abode of Islam, is fundamentally at odds with the direction history ought to be taking. However, with the rise of satellite television and so on in the Arab world, I know that in some parts of the Arab world there is a tendency for people to see what's going on in Israel and saying, why can't we have more of that? That is to say, a more thriving entrepreneurial economy. I don't mean that that's the dominant view, but apparently that is a view that is heard in the Arab world. And in some parts of the non-Arab Muslim world, one finds that as well. In Pakistan, for example, they look at this little country that seems to be doing so well economically, and they say, what are these people doing right? So it's a two-edged sword, I think.
Next question up here.
I was wondering if you could speak for a minute about the fact in the fiction about Jews and the slave trade.
Okay. I presume you're talking about Jews and the New World slave trade. To the best of my understanding and from the best of my reading, Jews were involved in the slave trade directly to a very minor extent. to somewhat greater extent indirectly. Let me explain what I mean. In the early modern period, in the 17th and 18th century, transnational Jewish merchant networks from Amsterdam and London to the Caribbean and to North America were important in the transatlantic transportation of new commodities. And some of those commodities, in fact, a good deal of those commodities were grown with slave labor. So Jews were very, I think almost, they were very rarely involved with actually owning slaves, though I'm sure there were some in the South that did. They were involved with the actual buying and selling of slaves to a very minor degree. But they sometimes were involved with buying and selling the goods that were the basis of the economy in Curaçao or in the Chesapeake or whatever, which was often based on slave labor. I was just reading some recent research on Jews as cotton merchants in the South, which they were to a small degree before the Civil War. They became much more involved as cotton merchants after the Civil War. So I think that's an honest and rounded answer.
Next question over on this side. Over here, Jerry.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, I found interesting kind of the early part of history where you say that you kind of begin the story that there's a certain predilection in around the 11th, 12th, 13th century where the Christians rediscover Aristotelian thought and kind of combine this with usury and say, this is the special place Jews can be. I'm wondering what happened for the millennia before that. That is to say, would we think that Jews were not particularly involved in trade and mercantilism, or was there already something leading Jews towards that predilection?
Yeah. So this is not an area that I'm particularly expert at, but the person who's done the most work on this is the scholar at Hebrew University, Michael Toch. And he finds that Jews essentially came to Europe, to Central and Western Europe in the 9th, 10th centuries in order to engage in trade. So it was trade opportunities that brought Jews to Europe in the first place. Their move and there was a close link between engaging in trade and money lending. That was one of the things that people needed. It was just that before this commercial revolution of the Middle Ages, there was less commerce. Jews were involved in it, but there was less of it, and hence there was less need for money lending.
The next question over here on your right.
In your discussion, you discuss the fact that cultural factors really influence the ability of Jews to do very well. In the book Startup Nation, which tried to also discuss cultural factors in Israel.
In which book? Oh,
Startup Nation.
Startup Nation, yes, by Saul Singer, yes.
Yes, he emphasized cultural factors as well. Among them, that failure is not stigmatized among these Jews. And two, they don't believe in hierarchical respect, so to speak. The CEO doesn't necessarily command the respect he does or control that he does in this country. Do you think this is typical of a new direction among Israeli Jews, or would this is just and very different than the cultural aspects in this country?
Yeah. So Startup Nation's a very interesting book by Saul Singer and his brother-in-law, whose name is escaping me now. But it's about It's about this transformation of Israel into an entrepreneurial country, and they do tend to emphasize elements that are particular to the Israeli experience, including the experience of going into the army, being given a great deal of responsibility at an early age. If you're very smart, going into one of these elite computer units from which then people rapidly move into high tech in Israel. And what they tend to play down is that there's a propensity to entrepreneurship, the Jewish entrepreneurship, that long precedes the founding of the State of Israel. They actually, some of the factors that I've mentioned today sort of tend to get played down in that book. I think there is a tendency that comes from deeper patterns in Jewish history that is sometimes functional in the Israeli context and sometimes dysfunctional. You know, because Jews often lived in places where the law or the rules were rigged against them, they had a tendency to be skeptical of rules and to try to go around them, right? And that has been embodied in the State of Israel in ways that in some ways are good. It creates a lot of independence of thought, which is important for entrepreneurialism. But at some point, if you're going to have an ongoing institutional entity like a bureaucratic corporation, you're going to need people who are willing to follow the rules most of the time. It's quite striking that Israelis are very good at founding and building new companies. They're not very good at creating large, sizable, ongoing companies, which is why a lot of them, when they do build a new company, they sell it to some other foreign company, which makes a lot of sense in terms of international distribution and so on. So there are elements, in short, of Israeli entrepreneurial culture that do have deeper roots in Jewish history in ways that, as I say, are sometimes very positive and sometimes can be pretty dysfunctional too.
Last question right here.
Well, you've taken us on an incredible journey of history, and I'm wondering, now looking forward into your crystal ball of the future, given some of the trends of intermarriage, and certainly the Jews are not the only people who are focused on higher education anymore. We don't own the corner on those markets. Mm-hmm. Where do you see capitalism and the Jews looking out another 15, 20 years from now? What happens?
Well, you know, as an historian, my specialty is predicting the past. I think that it's true that, Jews have never been the, only ethnic subculture in America that valued education, although they have tended to do so disproportionately. But one of the fascinating phenomena in the last 30 or 40 years is the influx of groups from Asia, especially from China and from India, that have some of these same, at least educationally oriented orientations. Sometimes they're by peoples like Chinese who have a tradition of being a merchant minority in other parts of the world and bring that tradition with them as well. And it's both, and so it's predictable and increasingly obvious that those people are going to play a larger role in the American educated professions and in American economic life. I don't see Jews being really marginalized either from the educated professions or from the world of commerce. Maybe in some parts of the universities, pressure to hire people on the basis of not of their achievement, but on the basis of their origins will affect their opportunities, and actually already has. But there's enough other parts of the society that my guess is that Jews, on average, will do disproportionately well. Now, I want to emphasize on average, right? There's a lot of Jews who aren't very good at capitalism. There's a lot of Jews who aren't very good at school, right? But we're talking about broad generalizations, and I don't see reasons why those broad generalizations should change in 15 or 20 years. It's true that, one big change that one already has seen is that at the highest levels of achievement in science, for example, where Jews often used to those Jews who were typically the first generation offspring of immigrants tended to not just be smart, and educationally oriented, but work very hard. And so you had a lot of Jews winning Nobel Prizes in the natural sciences and so on. I think you are seeing that less and less. It's not that Jews aren't going into learned professions and not that Jews aren't going into commerce, but that kind of super effort that's required to hit the highest levels of scientific and medical research is something that my friends tell me they see less and less among younger Jews. Which isn't such a bad thing. You know, somebody's got to work really hard and make those new discoveries.
I want to remind everybody that we're going to have a reception immediately following the program, and Jerry Muller is going to be signing books. So please join us for those things out immediately in the atrium. Jerry Muller, thank you so much.
I went on a bit longer than I had intended, but
we've gotten everything in.
yeah.
Got the questions. Let's go back this way.